Thank you, Trina. What we're going to do today is going to be, I think, fairly wide-ranging, and so we're going to be moving quickly through a number of issues. What we try to do in emergency management is learn and then apply the lessons that come out of that, and they can come from any corner of the world. Today, the earthquake and tsunami and nuclear meltdown in Japan will be our focus, but as a starting point for discussing issues that we're going to be facing here. So what we're going to do, and John and I will kind of tag team this, we're going to talk about what happened in Japan and what happened here as a result of what was happening in Japan that very night, and what we did about it, what it means for us, and long-term for the country, because we think there are some very valuable lessons that need to be captured and applied about the interdependencies that we have with each other. So without further ado, I'll let John start. He's going to take us through the incident in Japan.
Thanks, Jim. We're going against most of the rules of PowerPoint. PowerPoint is often putting up words that we're also speaking up here. It's all images. It's all images that show what the disaster did within Japan. And we'll use that to illustrate what the government and industry and the private sector did before the event and how that work saved lives, how it will now affecting them now that 6 months later. Our two states, along with California, Hawaii, and then the territories of the Pacific, were all affected by this on that same night. The earthquake that struck was one of the 5 largest ever recorded. Now, we have history on this that within my state we have the 2nd largest that were ever recorded, the largest being in Chile in 1960. Alaska had 9.2 in 1964. And to give you an indication of the power that's released, a 9.2 earthquake is measured not in kilotons of TNT, not in megatons, but is the equivalent to 1 billion tons, a gigaton. Imagine how much energy that is to move the planet. And on this event, it was so wide-ranging that it, almost 24 hours after the event, that wave reached Antarctica and broke a 20-square-mile iceberg off of an ice shelf. It had power after 8,000 miles to still be able to do that. We've got the advance. Japan is often said, well, it's about the size of California. Well, in square miles, it's about right. But from the far north to the far south, it's the same distance as from Vancouver to Tijuana. It is the entire distance of the U.S. West Coast. The difficulty is that within Japan, 73% of the land is not suitable for industry or for residential. That means that the 127 million people live on only 27% of the land, and most of that land is around the coast. That puts concentrations of population on average of about 3,500 people per square mile. Then in the cities, it's even more. They could have 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 people living within a square mile. And it is that area in the northeast, that was hit. This happened at 2:46 in the afternoon in Japan. It was 8:46 in Alaska, 9:46 in the evening in Washington State. And as we look at that, let's put the context first. Japan is the 3rd largest economy in the world measured by GDP. It's the 4th largest exporter, the 4th largest importer. And in that 1,200 miles are many hundreds of islands. When that tsunami struck, it was first the earthquake that hit hard and shook buildings and caused land to subside, or liquefaction. Within 20 minutes, the effects of that earthquake had an epicenter in the water. The first of the tsunami waves started coming in. The tsunami wave is not as you might see it in the movies. It's a series. It's a pulsation. And the tide charts or the water charts showed about 3 or 4 an hour for many, many hours. And it's not always the first one that's the biggest. And we'll have some images up here that show the before and after, so that it's not just earthquake, and it's not just tsunami. It is fire, it is environmental, it is radiological, it is power transmission lines. This is an example of a very viable community. And in the next one, that's the same community. Not the day after, but several months after. The entire level of the land subsided, so that is at high tide, when it used to be very well protected and 6 or 7 feet higher. That's what a tsunami looks like. And that water came in for hours with that much power. And you can see here that there's a major road behind the seawall that was built to protect against a tsunami. But the tsunami was bigger. And that much power coming in pushed that water in some areas up to 6 miles inland. There are very few places on the planet that you plan for a tsunami 6 miles inland. That's damage from the earthquake, showing buildings down. And that's some of the first responses of, if you don't know what to do something. And that's picking up people from the coastline one at a time. This is starting to introduce, and Jim and I will talk about it later, the interdependence. These are shipping containers. They have goods coming in, goods going out. With that level of disruption, it breaks a supply chain. And all those containers are not just physical damage, that's also jobs and livelihood and economic. It wasn't too long after this disruption within northeastern Japan before it affected car assembly plants in this country. These cars were shoved together by the earthquake, inundated by the tsunami, and then as all the fuel came out after the water retreated, then they're all burned. Not just one effect, but many. Around this nation in this year, we've had 89 presidentially declared disasters. 89 in this year. It's the most we've had and the highest pace since we've been keeping records. That's a federally declared disaster about every 90 hours, about one every 3 to 4 days. In that, we deal with destruction. This is a destruction beyond anything that we've had in many years. This is what a small area that was next to a larger area, which was next to an even larger. The citizens of that community, the businesses of that community, and the government officials of that community dealt with devastation beyond the ability to comprehend. Disruption to rail. In one line, they had 680 breaks in track or loss of bridges along just one line of about 20 miles. This is a fire at a refinery on the coast where by itself would have taxed the resources of that community to the very edge. 16,000 people died in this disaster. But when you look at those numbers, as tragic as they are, there were thousands more who lived because of their preparedness. And of those 16,000 people, 92% died from drowning. That meant that the 5th largest earthquake in the history of the civilization killed 1,100 to 1,200 people. That's tragic, but it's an indication that buildings were built to withstand it, and people knew what to do when the earthquake hit. So that was one part of it. On this was a rapidly, this happens with every disaster, about trying to figure out where your relatives are, try to reunify. And looking at the pattern of those fatalities, it's also true that 65% of the victims, 65% of the people who died were over the age of 60. That's an indication of not only population density, but maybe it's something also about how they were educated onto it. We all rely upon our first responders, fire, police, emergency medical, to deal with the emergency and try to bring some order out of the chaos. But a first responder cannot respond first forever. This man is one who's rushing from one point to another trying to do help, and he will do that until he collapses. Where does his relief come from? There were hospitals that were damaged, and there were people with chronic care inside those hospitals hit by the earthquake and the tsunami. They were trying to deal with this as best they could with as many people as they could. Movement of one critical care patient may require 3 or 4 or 5 health care. In the devastation, what preparedness does it take to be able to put a trained person every 10 feet going through the rubble? That's not something you create on the day of the disaster. There was discussion about the successful response and the immediate response, the swift response in Tuscaloosa and Joplin and other areas, and we owe that to having valuable people, well-trained, that were there. And the value should be as important on the day before the disaster as it is the day after. That trainer and that dog needed skills developed over many years. And as it takes a dedication of state and local people and volunteers to build that capability and sustain it, even if the threat is low. Now I'll turn the conversation back over to Jim, but I do want to say that on the infrastructure within Japan, there are some notable exceptions that did not make the news. That the power industry was very hard hit, but wind turbines, and they had hundreds of them, not one failed. The day after the earthquake, 252 dams were inspected, and 6 were found with minor cracks. Only one unofficial irrigation dam failed. So mitigation for making those dams hold under that big of an earthquake did happen. And in the sheltering, which is an example here, within 5 days, they were sheltering 500,000 people inside their communities and transported away. And I will end with this, that the skills necessary during these events are not found usually in one person, one organization, or one agency. The skills to locate victims is one set. The skills to extract are another. The skills to transport are another. And then the skills to treat and shelter are yet another. It must have the entire enterprise of preparedness. And as Jim is talking about some of the issues that he sees from this and the actions that we took on here, I'll have other images screening up here just to illustrate it. So Jim?
Thanks, John. I mentioned when I introduced this that we would talk about what happened here in this country when that occurred. I was getting ready to go to bed, which is a little bit early for me, but I had a long day. It turned out to be a much longer day. But I was ready to go to bed about 10:15. I had not heard the news of the event, and I saw a flash on a TV screen. And you're supposed to react very quickly to these things. In my business, we learned to just immediately get going. But I stood there for about 10 minutes watching a live helicopter feed from a Japanese TV station where a very excellent translation was describing the carnage that was sweeping across that Sendai and some of the other areas. And you literally could see trucks and cars driving towards the tsunami because they hadn't gotten word what was happening. And you could see the waves heading toward them. And you really wanted to say, get out of the way. And you realize this is big, this is a problem. So what happened in my state and what happened in Alaska and Oregon and California was our EOCs immediately activated to begin to monitor the possible impacts on the west coast of the United States. The same thing happened in Hawaii as well. Now, I'm going to use some acronyms in a minute, but I hope everyone knows that the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration is NOAA, and they're attached to the National Weather Service, or the National Weather Service is attached to them. So when I talk about NOAA, if I mention them, please excuse the use of an acronym. There's a California Integrated Seismic Network that is, which was tracking a lot of this information. But a message came telling us that we were under a tsunami watch, which indicates that some action of us may be necessary, but data is still being analyzed. I think John, being a little bit closer to this action, had the same message. It wasn't long before, again, we were beginning to communicate with local and tribal officials on our coast and our intercoast as well, to tell them to stand by. We were going to be on a conference bridge with the Warning Center in Alaska to try to get an update on what was happening. And these calls went on pretty much on routine throughout the night. Within each hour, we would have a conference call with an updated report from the Warning Center. We would then have a call with our local folks, talk about what that meant for us, what it didn't mean for us, and proceed to take whatever measures we needed to take. We were getting very accurate information about what was happening because years ago, and I'll probably mention federal grants a couple times, years ago a number of our legislators were successful in getting buoys placed out to sea, and that allowed a lot of data to be recording the height of the waves as it rushed towards our shores. And that information was being relayed to us about the size of what was happening. That enabled the Warning Center to project for us up and down the coast where our action points would be, where we would be hit hard and where we wouldn't. Now, every time it passed a different set of buoys, more data was generated. So the first round sounded like it was not conclusive, but it looked like we wouldn't have a bad problem. By the second or third conference call, it was clear that one site in our state, on our coast, was going to have about half a meter of waves, which isn't that bad, on a beach. A place in Oregon was going to get hit pretty hard in one location. In California, there were a couple locations that were supposed to be hit. So we knew that. Now, what did we do with this information? Well, for years, we've been working, again, with a variety of federal grants and local initiative to develop an exercise program where people can practice getting out of the way of a tsunami, getting to high ground. And this is not unlike what they're doing in Oregon, California, or Alaska, but we had to have a system where if it's an imminent threat, we have a siren system that can go off, and people have practiced on the sirens because we test them every month. If it's this kind of an event where we have more time, we know that in 2 or 3 hours we can move people off the coast, most of them. We have no illusions that we'll get everyone out of the way. And we have no illusions on a cold, dark night, and it was raining on the West Coast. This may be a shock. It was raining in Washington State in March. If we moved people, there were going to be injuries, perhaps some deaths, just because of the trauma of trying to move suddenly and the confusion that would result. We didn't have to do that, but it was very interesting to me because, as I've mentioned when I testified in favor of the renewal of some of those programs, the reason I didn't have to pull the plug was I wasn't dependent on news outlets. I was dependent on scientists who had good data that was being validated every hour that told me I did not have to move the coast inland. The population did not have to move. That's important from a standpoint of being able to trust what you can do. We also knew that if we were wrong, if the information was changing, in 2 to 3 hours we could move an awful lot of people out of harm's way. So it was very useful. Now, had this event happened in the middle of the day, we would have had another problem. I'm going to be very honest with you about this. The national media, in my estimation, got this completely wrong. They were West Coast on tsunami warning. No, we weren't. We were on a watch and then an advisory, and then we knew specifically what parts of our respective states might be hit, and we were prepared to deal with that. Closed some beaches, kept some people away, State Patrol ready to assist the local sheriffs. Everybody was kind of on board with that. It's one of those things. There's always a danger when Fox and MSNBC agree on something because they both got it wrong. And you have to wonder about that sort of thing, because we were listening to the radio. The national media would come on. As I was racing to my office, I was listening to several stations, and they were saying this very West Coast under immediate threat. Fortunately, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. No one's up except people like me. And then the locals would come out and say, we're not hearing that from the center. The warning center and the state EOC is telling us that it's going to be something in Moclips, Washington, but that's the only place where they're going to be hit. So we were able to get the local media to really step up, and because they had, and the reason they knew that this was they work with us. When we have an exercise or a disaster exercise or a drill of some kind, they're there and covering it. They're in on the planning meetings. They know that we're all working on this, and they know that we have good information and good data. So the value of that, from our standpoint, was if we'd had to move something, we could. And for this type of event, if we didn't have to move it, we also knew what not to do. And what not to do sometimes is as important as knowing what you have to do. So those were some of the things that we were concerned about. The first question was, how bad is it? And that governed everything else that we did. The key takeaway from this event is the working relationships that are built up before the event, as John was talking about, the trust levels that have been built up between the locals, their elected officials, us, the scientists that we work with every day, the local media, that helped us manage this and keep it from boiling over into a bigger crisis than it needed to be. That same set of relationships would have enabled us to credibly move people out of harm's way had we had to do that. And to me, that gave me some measure of confidence. What it doesn't do is help me too much with the problem. If we have a subduction zone quake a few miles off of our coast or John's coast, we'll get hit much quicker, and that's when our warning siren system, our emergency evacuation efforts, and our plans to try to develop vertical evacuation capabilities in a lot of regions around our state are going to be very important. But for this event, we were able to manage it at the ground level. And for that, we're exceedingly grateful. So the concern you have, though, is cascading events. And I think we'll probably spend some of the time now talking about that. The problem in Japan that occurred, I think there were 4 disasters, and just in my estimation. One was, of course, the earthquake, which was extremely important, which John may have some things to say about in terms of the coverage of the earthquake. That did damage. That hurt people. The tsunami did more damage, hurt more people. The meltdown dominated all of the media throughout the world, some of it with some pretty silly warnings and threats coming over. And the fourth thing was, in the midst of all this, the fourth disaster is when government loses, and the private industry, for example, loses the confidence of the people. And what happened, I think, tragically, was there were some people really shaken because they weren't sure they were getting the straight information from their government or from others that should be who had a public trust to observe. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I've talked to an awful lot of emergency managers and scientists from Japan who've come over to visit us and talk to us about what happened, and there's some clear indications that the same thing we know is you don't get many chances in a disaster to get it right and to be credible and be believed by your citizenry. And once you lose their trust, it's really hard to get it back. So we spend an awful lot of time trying to make sure that we say what we know, and when we don't know something, we say that, and we come back and try to fill in the gaps on what we know and what we don't know, and try to make sure that we'll always be giving the right information to people. And John, you want to jump in?
And that also illustrates that until recently, many communities and states had an earthquake plan separate from a flood plan, separate from any other plan. You must plan for many things to happen and happen under the worst conditions. If this had been a different type of event, it was still, for my state, it was in the middle of the night, it was in the middle of winter, very bad weather in some of the most remote places on the continent. But every community along there was informed. Every community had a plan. Every community had safe haven that they had picked out themselves. I wish we could claim credit, but 6 months before this tragedy, we held a tsunami workshop for all of the communities along the Aleutians and the southwestern Alaska. brought them in, not just the emergency managers, but the school superintendents, the chiefs of police, the fire, the EMS, the health industry. Now let's look at this totally. When it happens, what do you plan to do? Here are some guidelines, but what do you choose yourself? And in doing that, we found that it will serve us well if it's a close earthquake. This was a distant one for us, in which it took 4 hours for that tsunami to go from Japan to western Alaska, 5 hours to sweep across the entire part, and it was up to 10 hours afterwards that it came into to Washington State. If the earthquake is closer, it's like in the 1964 earthquake, it was minutes of warning, if any. And it means that you need an educated, informed, practiced citizenry along with the solid science and along with the other parts. There are a couple of things here, these before and after, or during and after, that illustrate that planning before, even if you may get overwhelmed in the response, the planning before about how you will create the order, how will you bring chaos, end the chaos, how can you restore the essential services. This is on the night. After the earthquake, there was fire. All those things. From the exact same vantage point, that's the same community about 4 months later. All the debris is gone. The roads are open. The power lines are back up. That doesn't happen by deciding afterwards what to do. This is just as after they cleared part of the road just to get to areas to search for victims. Same area in which they are now starting to, they finished the debris and they're starting to assess the houses and probably move in. That's a sign that you need to think your way through. You need a problem-solving enterprise, that you don't just do the obvious. Yes, that's a ship on land. Do we need to get the ship off of it? Not yet. You need to clear everything out around it first and then do it in order. And here's the example that if you can get a bicycle through first, then you can lead to a motorcycle and trucks and other things. The interdependence is so important. You know, there are many ways in which you can work through what do we need to do. But it's not by, oh, the bridge is cost a lot, so let's protect the bridge. It's not the cost of the bridge, it's the value. And it's not the cost of the power plant, it's the value of it. And how many people are dependent upon it? What are the consequences of the loss? How do those pieces fit together so that you can think before the event, this is the place where I need to invest my dollar to make sure that this piece of infrastructure, this essential service, does not fail, or I can bring it back quickly. And that it is as important for the safety of life as it is for the economic recovery. You cannot recover a community until you've cleared the streets of the debris. You cannot expect everyone to go back into work until there are goods on the shelves, until the children are in school. All of these things fit together. And to make those decisions afterwards is 10 times more difficult than to do it in peacetime when the sun is shining. But it's also more difficult for people in local and state and federal governments to concentrate on it when there hasn't been a disaster. It's been 60 years, almost 70 years, since an earthquake of this size hit the Japanese islands. We do not need to wait until the disaster before we start planning for it. The lessons from this are that even in the most critical times, even with the most serious disasters, with everything is turned upside down, your planning works, and your planning helps respond more swiftly, recover more swiftly, know the needs of your community. Jim?
And I think what's incumbent on emergency managers to do a couple of things. One of them is to tell the communities that we're going to have to figure out what our assets and resources are that we can share from the private industry, from local government, from state government, from other sources, and make the best use of those resources no matter what. You never know when, not that this would ever happen, where there'd be a delay in Congress of needed financial assistance because of some need to figure out where the money's going to come from in the middle of a disaster. That discussion's fine to have, not when people have water up to their ankles or their homes have floated away. We want to have that discussion when things are dry and we can have a rational discussion about what our priorities are. But the other piece of this is we need to look at the discussion of what was the post-disaster landscape likely to look like. Think about the worst thing that could happen in your community and begin thinking about, okay, what would our new normal look like? How would we plan that? That goes beyond what emergency managers are capable of doing, but it certainly is something that a community can begin to think about and begin talking about. There are a lot of issues that are not the easiest things to take up. It takes some courage, I think, to get into some of these areas, and I'm pretty good at telling other people to be brave. The fact is, we need to be thinking about some of these hard choices, dealing with mass fatalities, dealing with other kinds of issues on a scale that we haven't ever known. Those are things that we're going to have to pay attention to. In our state, one of the things that we're trying to remind ourselves to do is that with all the bells and whistles, all the buoys, all the sirens and everything else, those are only some of the tools that we have to use. The best resource we have is to teach residents and visitors and businesses in tsunami inundation zones about natural warning signs like ground shaking and facilitating an institution of a preparedness culture on a local level. That's where the lives will be saved. All those other things will help a little bit, but people need to know what to do, and they need to do the right thing, and they need to do it in the proper time frame. And we need also, as we get resources, and we have some good federal resources that are, like everything else, in question right now, but we need to leverage those a lot better by law, I think. Funding from the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program can't be used directly to improve our preparedness for tsunamis. And funding from NOAA, National Oceanographic Atmospheric Administration, for tsunami preparedness isn't designed to be used for earthquake preparedness. That's silly. I don't think the public really thinks that makes any sense. I don't think it makes any sense. I'm reminded of a situation in about 2006 when the Pacific Northwest Emergency Management Agreement was signed between British Columbia, the Yukon Territory, Alaska, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington State. And I happened to be honored to be briefing the Premier of British Columbia and the Governor prior to their signing the document. And I talked about how this would enable us to share resources across the border and all that. The Premier said, well, Director, what you're asking us to do is sign something everybody in their right mind would think government already was willing to do for the last 20 or 25 years. So you're asking me to agree to common sense? I said, yes, Premier, that's exactly what I'm doing. He said, well, I'll sign that. But the fact is, the public didn't care. Somebody in Richmond, British Columbia, or Blaine, Washington, would expect those resources to be available if other human beings needed it. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to be very clear about. International mutual aid between our Canadian and U.S. Borders is an absolutely critical piece, and there's some national work going on now that we're heavily involved in, along with others, to try to make those agreements between Canada and the U.S. pretty flexible and easy, so that we don't have to go through an elongated process between the External Affairs Department of Canada and the State Department of the United States to get permission to get a firefighter from one country to another if something's burning. We really need to be able to do those kinds of things. So those are some of the things that we have to do. We have to leverage what we've got. A lot of it is our own common sense, and a lot of it is going to take some flexibility at the legislative level so that we can intermingle funds a little bit, and we can be audit proof and protect ourselves from mistakes of expenditure as well. But the key thing is to save lives, and most of what we're about is, in the end, is saving lives. Recovery works best when you've got people to recover, as well as an economy, as well as buildings and structures. We really need to make sure that we save as many lives as we can. We're as efficient with that as we can be. John?
Within our profession of emergency management and also Homeland Security, several of our colleagues have a picture of the whole globe taken from space and a little caption saying, if you live here, you are at risk. That is so true. And what we want to emphasize is that the effects of the disaster extend far beyond the rubble. If I have a disaster in my state that interferes with the flow of oil, Washington State will lose 78% of its oil going to the refineries. And they will be very limited on what they can do to help me or my state, my citizens, when they also are affected by it. A Cascadia earthquake is not only a tragedy for the Pacific Northwest coast. If it affects the movement of goods out of the West Coast, then my state will be at risk within a few days, because 90% of the goods for 80% of my population flow in through the port of Anchorage. We could be outside the rubble, not one single piece of infrastructure impaired, but a disaster in his state affects the citizens of my state. So that's where we need to understand about it. And I support everything that Jim is doing in Washington and our colleagues are doing in Oregon about a Cascadia, because we want to have a resilient Pacific Northwest so that we can retain a resilient Alaska. Hawaii is the same way. So every single thing that we do is affected by some other disaster. We recently supported our colleagues in the central United States with a new Madrid exercise. There was an earthquake in 1812 in the New Madrid area, which is around Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and about 8 states. If it were to happen again, it would be not only devastating in the economy, but in people. But it's also the perfect example that what else would happen? What are the other consequences? That's a major transportation route. If you cannot move goods across the Mississippi River because the bridges are down and the rails are down, what does that mean for the people on either side? We've had some of this in the Gulf as a hurricane rolls through. If it interferes with the refining of fuel, then it has an effect on New England, because the pipelines go from the Gulf Coast up to New England. It is all connected. That's why it is not, oh, we may have just dodged the bullet on that disaster. You may not. It just may not be rubble and may not be today. And I think that that supply chain issue is underestimated, even by our private sector colleagues. It's not just the interference of getting a Barbie doll onto the shelf at the grocery store or the department store. It is about the movement of pharmaceuticals. It's about the movement of food. It's about the movement of energy. And the basics that we need for food, water, energy, medicine, and shelter, most of those originate from outside of your own area. There's not a place in the nation that is self-sufficient. On a disaster of this scale, or even 1/10 this scale, there are disruptions in the provision of essential services. And how do you plan for that? Jeff?
You know, this is not a whine about declining budgets, because they're a concern to everybody. In emergency management, we know that we're increasingly challenged, but so are the programs that mean a lot to the health of our society, in criminal justice or early childhood education, other areas. And debates rage over the proper role of government and all of these things. The safety of our public and the health of the economy and the environment, though, shouldn't be in question. And we have an obligation to make effective use of every dollar that we receive, take our share of the cuts, and creatively attempt to work around these kinds of things. And so we're trying to do that. But what we do believe is one of the keys to success is to build and renew the capabilities at all levels. Take stock of what we have. Whether it's in a neighborhood, we have a program called Map Your Neighborhood that's in 29 states. It's a very good way of assessing what kind of tools you have just with the people that live around you. How ready are you for the types of risks that you have? But at all levels, cities, counties, tribes, states, federal, private industry, we've all got to become more receptive to involvement with each other to collaborate on how we're going to deal with a major disaster. And the public really needs to understand, and we need to listen to them regarding their concerns, because everyone has a role in protecting a part of the country. Everyone's got a role when a response is needed. And if that response is just sustaining yourself for 72 hours till the government can reconstitute itself, or if it's helping your neighbors, or if it's responding, as some of our people do, who as victims also are responding to the disaster to try to help other people, we need to make sure that we're coordinated and synchronized. You know, this isn't really a wrap-up, but I would say that renewal of what we've been about in this country comes, I think, as much through disaster response as almost anything I've seen. The one place where we don't do ideological fighting should be during a disaster. We don't care what the politics are or the religion is of someone who's on a roof that needs to be taken off. We just get them off the roof, and I think we try to get them back home and get their lives set up again. NEMA is really proud to be part of that effort. We're not the only ones, though, and I think the message that we have to give is that when something like that happens, we're all affected, and if we're human at all, we want to do the right things by the people that were hurt by this, and by the economy, and by the environment. And so how we do that is always a matter of debate and challenge, but we think it's extremely important when you look at an event like this and realize that that nation is probably the most prepared country in the world, and still stuff happens. And it's small comfort to any of us to hear just a few people die. One is far too many. We have to do the best we can to try to minimize the negative consequences of natural disasters or even human-caused disasters. We can't prevent them, despite USA Today's request to me of why do we have so many disasters. And I said, gee, are we the ones creating those things? But that's a news media outlet for you. It's really important that we come together and work on these things, and that as much as you, but I'm not just telling you to go back and hug your emergency managers, but listen to them before the disaster, pay attention to them now, let them tell you what they see the risks are unflinchingly so they don't get in trouble for giving you bad news. Let's start pulling the community together to deal with some of these things before they happen. John?
And on the matter of the media, this was a very intense time, and again, it happened with both of our jurisdictions overnight. And we were both at our emergency operations center. I got several calls from national media, and they said, we hear that you're under a tsunami warning. Well, at that time, yes, we are. Has it hit any place? Well, yes, it has. How many people died? Well, none. How many people were injured? None. Well, why not? They evacuated according to the plan after good notice. Well, where's the story? The story is that they evacuated and got to safe haven on their own, and the plans worked. And I can't tell you the number of national outlets that hung up on me because there was not a story, because the things worked. The other part on the media is that it did improve after a few days, but then it took a dramatic turn. It went completely away from the tsunami and the earthquake and that tragedy and went to Fukushima nuclear reactor. There was that major threat, and there was a lot of confusion coming out of Japan about what the levels were and everything else. But it quickly shifted within the international and the national media that the threat is now radiological. There was a headline on New York Times that said, radiation in Alaska. And it wasn't. They looked at the wind patterns and the ones that are used for international air travel. Oh, the wind patterns go from Japan over to Alaska. Yes, they do at 30,000 feet, 35,000 feet. There are a lot of layers in between, and that radiation was at ground level, and there was nothing pushing it up into the air levels that would immediately get to Alaska. They had found some government agency running scenarios, running events, gaming it. Under what conditions would we get radiation into this country? They were announcing as fact what was gaming on a computer simulation. And I was asked to be the spokesman, and I didn't realize until that afternoon that I am my governor's radiological dispersal expert. But if he wants that, then I am the radiological dispersal expert. But he did this for a reason. We needed to put the right focus on the right danger. There was a hazard on the radiological, and we were being aggressively searching it out, aggressively putting out filters and trying to find it. But it got to the point with the national media that I said, yes, I will answer a question about the radiological threat only if you ask me one question about the tsunami. And to their credit, they all did. So I could end the interview with saying, but let's not lose sight that 15,000 people died from a threat that exists here and has hit here and is an imminent threat anytime there's an earthquake. So it wasn't just having the media frame the story, we have a responsibility of getting it back onto the track. And I find that within our states, we were able to organize for that potential hazard very swiftly. Department of Environmental Conservation, Health and Social Services, my Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, we could get together and coordinate rapidly. We could go with our other states that were in that potential airflow rapidly. What we did not find for weeks was a unified federal voice of Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They all had experts, and I would have really benefited from having a nuclear scientist standing next to me saying, here's what's really going on. So it did coalesce later on, but until it coalesced, the states were on their own, working with our own experts, with our own people for it. And that's a challenge that I think we could probably expect during any time.
On that, just a couple of points. One is that FEMA was being under tremendous pressure to do something, anything. So, and I have some sympathy for them. They were being pounded on this, and they really weren't getting the support they needed from within the federal bureaucracy. And so they put a bunch of sensor instruments out on our coast, and lo and behold, they found some radiation. Well, as somebody pointed out, 6 months before the event, if you'd put those sensors out there, you'd have found radiation. Radiation is part of our lives. It's a question of levels, and the levels were no more developed than you would normally expect any day. If you go out on our sidewalk out here, with you'll pick up some radiation if you have sensitive enough instruments. It's everywhere. So that was one thing that was kind of difficult. And getting back to credibility, I think the anxiety over the perceived or real lack of safety of power plants in this country caused, and their proximity to faults, caused a retrenchment rather than a frank discussion to take place from the federal government to the media. And that, when they think they're being dodged or stiffed, the media smells blood, and they built the case up a lot more than they needed to be. And we've talked to them about that and told them, you didn't really make life easier for us because we weren't quite sure why you didn't just say, hey, there is no risk here. And maybe if you want to talk safety of power plants, talk about that. But don't mix this event and that issue too much, because that made people far more nervous than they needed to be. And again, I don't blame the press on this one at all, much as I'd like to. I think the government could have done a better job of coalescing behind a coherent message.
And it also brought up the fact that, not a fact, but my opinion, that you cannot speak exactly what you need to do with the public unless you rehearse it. Any small thing, anything that there's an opportunity in local government or at state where there's the need for confidence in government to continue, that usually doesn't happen by accident. When that radiological hazard emerged and all my citizens were getting concerned, they did not need 1,000 words describing all the symptoms and how potassium iodide was useful in some cases and not. They didn't need that. They needed a 20-word assurance. And that does not come naturally. That comes with practice. And I think that it also shows that, as Jim illustrated, that there were 3 natural tragedies and a human tragedy for the earthquake, and then the tsunami, and then the radiological, and then that challenge to the confidence in government. That is something that we need to plan for. The current vernacular at in FEMA and other federals is plan for the maximum of maximums. Well, that might mean the asteroid. We're not suggesting the asteroid. We're suggesting that things happen at bad times. An earthquake in the middle of the winter in my state will have far more dire consequences than an earthquake in the middle of the summer. As challenged as I am when I testify before Congress, it's really challenging when I address a second-grade elementary school class and they want to know, or should we be afraid of tsunamis? And to talk to them and the challenge to get it understanding through, it is really something that I came up with a little nursery rhyme. It hasn't been published yet, but when do we have to prepare for it? You have to prepare for it now because it could happen now. Could it happen tonight? Well, it could, But don't worry that there are ways in which we will try to inform you. So I made up a little nursery rhyme about you have to be prepared in January and in June, and at midnight and at noon. And there are a whole lot of second graders in my state that now remember that it's not just when they're in school that they need to have a little kit to turn to if an earthquake, they need it at home. And that compounding effect of the disasters is very prevalent.
By the way, I want to suggest that you patent that very quickly after we're through, because it's probably going to go viral now.
Well, we'll do it for attribution. Lake Otis Elementary School in Anchorage, Alaska. That it's not just one bad thing that happens to great proportion, it will be many things. The hurricane that causes a spill, the tornado that starts a fire, a flood that causes erosion. Many of those things will happen, one causing another or leading to another, or it just escalates out. In 2009, one of my 53 volcanoes erupted 20 times. And as we were dealing with the disruptions in maritime and air, then nationally H1N1 came in. So at the time we were dealing with potential disrupted air, we had to distribute the H1N1 from the Strategic National Stockpile. As we were doing that, we got historic floods on the Yukon River that had not happened in that part of the river for 100 years. And then, as we were responding to that, it was an early fire of a major Category 2 fire. We call that the season of flu, floods, flames, and flow. No plan that we ever had said, how do you deal with volcano and pandemic and fires and floods? You can't do that. But you can do, this is our command structure. This is our way of planning. This is our way of operating. This is our way of knowing what the needs are and knowing our capabilities and of setting priorities. And that's what you need to do in peacetime. And that is what Japan did, that even in the midst of all that destruction, they were able, within a very short time, to get 3 million households back on power within 2 weeks. To go from 500,000 in shelters to 500,000 in temporary housing. That doesn't happen by accident. That means you understand how things work, what can go wrong, what are the consequences, what can we do ahead of time to make the damage less, and what can we do ahead of time to recover swiftly. And that's the part in which there is no substitute for thinking it through. You may not get 100% of the solutions, but you're going to get many of them.
There are a couple of things that I think are important to note in your various positions in your various jurisdictions. One is that when something happens, you probably have somebody like me or like John who is trying to figure out what's happening, what the immediate problems are, and all that. I recall I've had the privilege of working for 3 governors and 5 mayors in my career, and one of the mayors, well, they were all pretty much hands-on, but one of them was particularly worried that he wouldn't get the straight scoop. And so what we did early on, when I was a young emergency manager, and I really was a young emergency manager at one time, I made up a bunch of questions. And I said, Mayor, you're in your car speeding to the EOC to take command. This is what we're working on. What happened? What are our immediate problems? What are we doing about it? How many people have been affected? In some order. So that when he walked in with his 23 questions, he knew we were going to brief him on what we knew. And very often, we had 3 or 4 of these events, we could only answer 2 or 3 of those questions, but it helped us a lot focus him on what the issues were. The other thing I wanted to say is, and that's important to always know, what are your people working on before you get any briefings? That will help you a lot if someone sticks a microphone in your face. The second thing is, when you do an exercise, oftentimes the exercises tend to emphasize the glitz of the response. You know, the people get out in the field, or they sit there and they handle messages that are problems, and they meet and they talk about it. But very rarely is recovery addressed the way it ought to be addressed. And we've tried a number of different ways to do this. In our state, we're doing a massive exercise next year that is totally locally and state generated. It is not going to be a big national level exercise. It's like a state and local level exercise where we're trying to find out what we can do for ourselves before any outside assistance comes in. What are our capabilities? And we're going to spend 2 days on logistics, wait a couple weeks, spend 2 days on response, and wait a month or so, and then we're going to do an extensive effort on recovery. Because you have different people in the room when you try to recover. You don't need a banker during a response when you're extricating people from rubble, but you need that banker, you need those other experts, you need the insurance companies, you need the Archbishop, you need people like that in there who can help the community develop a really big fist to support whatever needs to be done to restore and redirect the community. And we're going to spend a couple days. We'll take our earthquake out 30 days, then 180 days, and try to illuminate that. Now, the second thing we're doing, reason we're doing that, is because we have a gubernatorial change coming in at the end of next year. We know that, for one thing, there will be deputies that will be handling things until the new team is appointed. And we also know there'll be a new team coming in. So we're planning already to have a package set up so that the new governor and his team, and it will be a him apparently, will come in and at least know that there's a package there that can be used, that has been tested and has been evaluated, and an improvement plan exists if we have serious gaps, and I hope we will find our gaps, because there always are, and we'll begin to address them. Communities need to do that more. They need to really think about what's going to happen after the event. How are we going to fix this place? How are we going to pull together despite all of our other differences and get the community well again? So we can go fight about all the issues that we disagree on. But we first have to make sure that we pull the community together. So that's all I have.
So that does bring up the point about leadership. And leadership before the event is as important as leadership after it. Leadership to make sure that you can get your agency, your state, your county, your city, your neighborhood prepared. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do without the motivation. And the leadership is how you bring forth that. Within my state, the governor decided to hold his cabinet meeting inside of the State Emergency Operations Center. And for 3 hours, we went through all the things that the state is responsible for, but didn't leave it there. We said that you, the cabinet, are the leaders of the state government. What have you done within your own family to ensure you can do your job for the state? Do you have your family's Go Kit, communications kit, alternate sites, all those other things so that you can come in and do this job? And if you can't, find a way in which you have the continuity. So it is a very challenging thing to do when the sun's shining, is to think about such devastation. And recently, Miyagi Prefecture, that is one of the hardest hit on the Japan, drafted up their 10 points of recovery. And on those 10 points, about half of them were things that they could have done beforehand, about routes and evacuation and safe haven and infrastructure and some mitigation projects. But the other half are things that they could not have done before. You cannot change a city that's been in place for centuries and say, we will now separate out residents from commerce. We will now have green areas with natural berms to act as barriers for the tsunami. That's the challenge also that several American cities have faced. Greensboro is one of the ones in which they were leveled by tornadoes, and they came back with a plan to not just to rebuild as it was, to rebuild better. Rebuild green, rebuild for industry, rebuild for how they now have the opportunity of doing it. And I think that this is one of the indicators up here about it's so important not only in Japan as they're experiencing it now 6 months after, but in every place in the world, that it has an effect for a long time. And this one girl is about 6 years old. She's standing in front of a picture of her father. During that earthquake, the father was away from home. He knew the danger. He contacted his wife and daughter and said, "You're not in a safe place. Get to this shelter." They did. They survived. And he continued trying to get there himself, but he did not. They found him about a block away. but he is an informed citizen that knew what he had to do to protect his family. This is the challenge for all of us who have responsibilities for the lives of others. How do we go from devastation and utter hopelessness up to a point that you can restore that hope and have people look beyond the past and the damage to the future and the opportunity? And how do you build a citizenry in which those who are able are prepared? Those who are able can care for themselves so that we can focus in on those who cannot take care of themselves. That's the challenge that we have in all of our professions, in all of our jurisdictions, because we must be able to act when the world has turned upside down. We cannot wait. We cannot hesitate. We cannot wait for perfect information or leap to the obvious solution. Our leadership is someplace in between. Your challenge is to find the right way to prioritize so that you can continue your essential services under all conditions. That when money is tight, how do you invest your money in projects, your other responsibilities, so that when the time comes, not if, but when the time comes, you can serve your community, serve your state, and serve the nation. This is not science fiction. This nation has faced great tragedies before. The 1906 earthquake, the Chicago fire, Hurricane Camille, Galveston flood. Hundreds of them have happened because if you live in this nation, you live on this earth, you are at risk. That's what you must do, and that is the lessons learned from Japan.